You should try to figure out what's the worst thing that they could call me. Like, not like
the thing you're most afraid of?
The thing that I'm most afraid of. Like, what would be the thing that I do not want to have a reputation for? Figure out what that is and just know, as soon as your enemies figure out what that is what they're going to call you.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, guys, welcome back to the Grimké podcast. Excited to have Dr. Joe Rigney, Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews. I'm here in the room. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me, guys. Good to be here.
Yeah.
This is sweet. This is a sweet room. Like the lights. I feel like
It's got the vibes.
Tesla. You know, there's some kind of like, even the movie The Prestige.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I watched
Yeah.
that
This
scene
week,
where they
actually.
do that. Like,
Yeah,
I kind of feel like I'm that, but it's upside down.
Yeah. I didn't know Christopher Nolan actually was the
Yeah,
main
right?
producer of it. Yeah,
That's right.
It was amazing. I watched it this week actually.
The movie's all about
We watched
twins,
it about a month ago.
Right, twins.
Yeah.
It's a big giveaway.
Yeah.
My twins
What?
are
Oh
today.
my! You can't.
It's been out long enough.
Spoiler alert.
No, you don't have to give
Come on.
spoilers for
Same
stuff that's
room.
20 years old.
Not the same person.
Yeah.
Not the same person.
That's right.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I am sitting across from you.
That's true.
So,
Through the wonders of AI.
people have wondered. Is Joe Rigney Doug Ponder?
That's
or is
great.
Doug Ponder Joe Rigney?
Yeah, it's
Great. We clarified it. That's what the whole podcast is about today.
That'll be fun. Absolutely. And so we also have Brian Lachlan.
Glad to
If
be
you're
here as
tuning in for the
always.
first time. Doug Ponder. Glad to be here. Excited to have you all here. Excited to be talking about Joe's book,
Yes.
Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. Now, the interesting thing first for me about this is that I've read and benefited from material from a long time, and Bible, confessional theology, practical pastoral stuff, family, discipling men. You know, if you're hearing Joe Rigney talk, C.S. Lewis or Shakespeare are going to show up,
Probably.
maybe together.
Yes.
And the same thing.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky. So this kind of came out of the blue for me. So given all that you've studied, you did your doctoral work on Edwards.
Yep.
So how in the world did you end up adapting Edwin Friedman to this topic at this time? Where did this book come from?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I don't actually remember how I first got a hold of Friedman's Failure of Nerve, but it was probably like 2010, 11, 12, somewhere in there. And I know at some point Doug Wilson and I like bonded over it, but I don't remember if I gave it to him or maybe he gave it to me. It was something like that. And
Either way, you were trying to say something.
Either way, we were like, hey, this is good stuff. But I would teach a leadership class at Bethlehem College, and that became like the core text, and we would just work through it. And it was basically kind of this active translation because Friedman is very astute, perceptive. I think because he's a rabbi, that like his brain kind of runs in biblical ruts. Basically, you know, like he just has Bible.
You can tell. Right.
Like there's you can't not. But his brain also runs in evolutionary ruts. And so there was always this, like, why is the bacteria talking to the virus for like 3.5 pages? I don't know, but we're going to do it.
And the explorers, the
this,
Columbus
like,
and all
exactly.
that.
Like, so I hadn't actually thought of it that way, but like the fact that I lead with Shakespeare and some people pick up a leadership book and they're like, all of a sudden we're reading like this, like there's a page and a half of Shakespeare. What are we doing? And I'm like, it's an homage to Friedman. We're just doing this like random Magellan thing at the beginning of Failure of Nerve. But yeah, there was always this kind of translation thing.
Yeah.
And it would be really good because he's provocative, and you know, this is 2012, 13. You guys remember those days.
I do.
And so when he's talking about all of the stuff he's talking about, it was very palpable, but I don't think people had wrapped their hands around it. And so it was angsty.
Yeah.
And it's always fun to make students angsty.
That's right.
And so I was teaching that. So that's one little stream. Other stream was I was theology and lit at Bethlehem, and so I would teach Shakespeare every year. And I'm a big fan of René Girard, who wrote a book on Shakespeare called Theater of Envy. And so I was always doing this Girardian mimetic desire, all this kind of stuff. And then I'm doing the Friedman thing. And it's just like those things just jumbled in my head. And I read Lewis all the time. So it's like all three of those just kind of simmered for about 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
And then a big part of what happened was I'm teaching Friedman, and then it was just like the world conspires to just prove him right. You know, you're just watching, and it's like I'm literally, it's like, there it is again. There's like constantly his diagnosis keeps coming out, and I'm like, yeah. And then having conversations with fellow pastors or pastors at churches, and they're telling me about what's going on, and I'm like, hey, there's this Friedman, and so I'm always like dropping stuff in. You're getting triangled, there's herding instincts, and so I'm constantly doing that, and so it just simmered for a long time, and then it finally came out. Actually, like the first thing that was like outward was the empathy stuff.
Okay.
So when I did, and that came about because I was going out to Moscow to do, I think, their summer conference, Teenage Conference. And Canon said, hey, since you're going to be out here, we got this new idea for a show called Man Rampant. Amazon, like at the time, Amazon was just like, give us all your content. We'll just put it on Prime. And so Canon was like, we'll jump at that.
Yeah.
And so they were going to try this sort of show thing with Doug interviewing people. And they were like, will you be our guinea pig? And I was like, glad to. What do we want to talk about? And I was like, sin of empathy. Yeah. Because I knew Doug and I had this Friedman thing, and we both like Gerard too. So let's just do that. And so we did it. And then again, everybody conspired to prove our point. Like we just threw that out there, and it was just kaboom. I always joke that it's like we were warning people that like sometimes, watch out for flammable heads. And then everybody lights their hair on fire. And you're like, yeah, that's what we meant. That's what we meant. So like that blew up, and you had empathy wars for a couple of years, and that would kind of flare up here and there. Yeah. And I kept, kind of working that over. Like everybody went through whatever happened between 2014 to like 2021, whatever that season was of the future historians will call it the era of high wokeness or something.
That's right.
And so working through that in various ways. And so then when I moved to Moscow 18 months or so ago, Canon said, hey, you've always done stuff on that. Would you want to do something? Would you want to turn that into something? And I was like, and I had various kind of talks that I had done on it. And so I was like, yeah, I think I can pull that together. And so we did a video series. And after getting done with the video series, I was like, that was about probably 15, 16,000 words of, straight to camera content. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I bet I could probably come up with another 10 to 12. You guys want a book? And they were like, sure. And so that was like last fall, 14 months ago. Okay. And I just, I had the whole thing from the video, and then I just like built it out, and they went for it. And it's been kind of a little bit of a crazy whirlwind of a year with it. Like I think it's probably, I don't know this because I don't know all my numbers from like Crossway, when Things of Earth was a Crossway, and Strangely Bright. I know Strangely Bright at one point hit 10,000 copies after a couple years, but that hit 10,000 copies last fall.
Wow.
Like in like 9 months. And gets in and has gotten into like really odd places. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Secretary of Defense. Well, I don't know if he got, if they're voting on him today. I don't know. So like we're recording this in January, and like Hegseth, he's a CRAC guy, and his pastor gave him a copy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I had a similar story. I met Friedman, read his book in 2010, and started reading. I was like, this was written like last year, right?
Yeah.
And then
90s.
I know, like early 90s. Yeah. And I was like, well,
pre-internet.
How in the world? And so, and ran into the same problem of like, I can't give this to everyone,
right?
Because there's so much translation. And I think what I love about your book is that it is having the same effect on people, but in a more fruitful way. Is maybe Friedman had on us. Like we read it, like, oh. So what do you think about what Friedman wrote? Why does it resonate still now, 30 years later, some of these concepts? What about them kind of makes people curious?
Yeah, so I think, so what he was saying, I think there's just a deep continuity between basically like, I don't know how far back it goes. I wasn't alive then, but like 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, and then once the internet and the social media hit, it just kind of turned it up to 11. Yeah. And so he was seeing the stuff, but he was seeing it sort of more organically, and then we technologified it and just like all that social media does is amplify the normal stuff.
Sure. Yep.
And so I just think he was seeing it in his counseling practice and the consulting he was doing, and seeing these dynamics, and was just a very shrewd observer of human nature, and didn't really have, I don't think, had a very, like at one level he's got it's probably as good of a solution as you can have for not being a Christian, of like, be a well-differentiated, well-differentiated leader with a non-anxious presence. And it just like rolls off the tongue there, bro.
That's right.
But
not a salesman.
Yeah, not a salesman. Right. Definitely kind of a psychology dude. And so that actually is a pretty good answer, but it's like, how do you become well differentiated? How, what is it? How do you maintain a non-anxious presence? And it was all psychological, evolutionary stuff. So he was really good at diagnosing, and then had the sort of the hints of a common grace sort of natural solution. And so, but for me in teaching it all those years, it was very easy to kind of go like, man, this is just like for a while, I don't think I did this in the book, but like for a while I would be like, he says, self-differentiated or well-defined. I would just say grace defined.
Right. Sure.
Right. Like, and it was by the grace of God, I am what I am. So Paul is saying like, I'm not seeking men's approval. I'm seeking God's approval. He has approved me in Christ. So by the grace of God, I am what I am. Yeah, that gives him definition and gives him steadiness. And so there you have all of everything that Friedman has, but you actually have some like spiritual substance to it. Yeah. And so that was kind of a big part of the translation work that I was doing all those years with my students. And it was funny when I look back, because there was always some students who just ate it up. Like they were just like, oh, I now understand my family. Like it was like, now I know what's been happening all these years. But there was a lot of folks who resisted it, did not like it, felt like it was anti-Christian. At least sub-Christian. He's talking about viral members of society who basically function like viruses and hijack things, and they're terrorists, emotional terrorists. Yeah. And some people were like, this is not the way of Jesus. He's like, sometimes you just send people away. Right. And they're like, Jesus came for the lost. Jesus came for the sick. Right. He's talking about societies are sick when they accommodate and adapt to the weakest and most immature of society. Right. And so this was actually really fun in a classroom setting to go, Paul says, accommodate your brother, right? If it causes him to sin, you accommodate him, you cater to him. Right, his weakness of conscience, and Friedman's like, you must not do that. And so wrestling with like, well, is that what Paul's talking about? Yeah, is that what he's talking about? Yeah. Is a really fruitful thing to do in a leadership class. And so there's all kinds of really good stuff that came out, and I had to really sharpen the thinking by the pushback. In the early days of what's now I'll call wokeness. It was really like there was the intensity, and it was like you could feel like this is what he's talking about. Yeah, like when he talks about that angsty reactivity, it's like that's what's in this classroom, that's what's in the air around us, that's what blows up every so often. And so it was just very astute that he wrote what he did, and then he died.
Before he finished
the book, and his family kind of like throws together. It's like, do you even read the last chapters? Like, no, because it's like just notes.
He also said he wrote every chapter synchronously, so he didn't write like 1 through 10. Like he was constantly writing all 10 chapters, and then died. It's like the whole thing's.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a super fascinating book, but it is the sort of book that you can't just give to anybody. Right. They need to have a certain degree of maturity, be able to sift through some of the evolutionary gobbledygook, and so it was limited. And so then that was when Cannon said, let's do this. It was like, oh, this is going to be, this will be really good. Yeah. And now I'm like, it's been really encouraging to get the feedback kind of at all different levels of like with the targets I was aiming at in terms of home and churches and the wider culture. Yeah. I get good feedback kind of straight down the line.
Awesome. And it's refined. You could tell as you were working through. I mean, you had a captive test audience for 10 years.
Yeah, right.
So you're able to test it out, refine the thought, understand actually how it was interacting with the folks you were serving. Yeah. So
I love that
you feel it as you read it.
You've brought the concepts finally into a way it's usable in the church. So Friedman, got a lot of this from Murray Bowen.
Yep.
And they were working together as colleagues, and it was interesting because Murray Bowen was we don't think religious at all. Yeah. And they had this fight that we have recorded where Murray Bowen was unwilling to say anyone is evil or does evil things.
Right.
And Friedman's like, no, like there is actually evil in the world. And so we went from really sociological gobbledygook to no, there is evil things, and then you bring in like, and we have an answer to evil, right? And we have what Christ has done, and we have grace, and we can. So it's like this progress in the thoughts.
Well, and it's interesting too, like the whole Bowen family. I've not gotten into Bowen. I've never read him, but there are other guys. I've read other books that have tried to basically take Bowen family systems and Christianize it. Right. And what's interesting is how frequently it can kind of get turned on its head.
Yeah.
So because one of Friedman's key insights is, have this non-anxious presence, which means you stay cool and calm when everybody else is blowing up, right? It's sort of the, what's the, if.
It's like control rod.
What's the if, the poem, if you can keep your head when all about you,
right.
yeah, the manhood one, when all about are losing theirs and blaming it on you, like that's a really good, that's a Friedman-y kind of thing. But what sometimes happens is people get it from Christian psychological therapeutic context. Yeah. And what they do is you come into the room sober-minded and they're like, brother, I don't think you have a very non-anxious presence because you're causing me, because you're making me nervous. Like I think everybody's really anxious whenever you show up. And so they're like, you don't have a non-anxious presence. And so it's like this really weird way where it kind of it gets weaponized back on you. And so I've talked to pastors who have had that move run on them because they are keeping their head and everybody's like, dude, you're making us nervous. Because what it is you're unpredictable.
Right.
Everybody else is predictable. We know where the levers are.
Yeah.
We know how to manipulate. We know how, to get them back in line. But you come in here and you're just like, I might say something. And that makes us nervous.
Yeah.
And so you don't have a non-anxious presence. And brother, we really need to have a non-anxious presence. And so it's a really, so I didn't want to do that because I think that's a misapplication of what Friedman was after, which is more about you. Are you caught up in the emotion? Do you get bowled over by the passions that are raging in the room or in the culture? That's what he was after. You take responsibility for you.
That's awesome.
I was reading the book, which the pastors of my church read together several months ago as well. It struck me as we were working through it, just how many of the things that you address in this book were things I'd already seen and felt in the last 15 years of ministry. And some of the images that you use throughout the book, different illustrations or turns of phrases, one that kept coming back to me was to act in such a way that you don't give your enemies a steering wheel, where you enable them to essentially control and direct where you're going to go because of how you conduct yourself, or more importantly, how you react to the ways that they're conducting themselves. You were just talking about that a second ago with the levers, right?
Yes.
And they kind of know that if I make fun of you, if I insult you, if I use certain words, if I label you as a bigot or whatever the label is, they can use these labels to get you to immediately say, oh, well, I don't want to be that thing. So instead of saying, well, I'm not that thing. And I know I'm not that thing because I'm just saying what the Bible says, and God's not a bigot. The Lord Jesus is not a bigot. You kind of walk things back, right? And in the process of doing so, you are enabling them to actually control the conversation that the church should be leading out on. And so as I was reading, I was just thinking about how this is so pertinent for pastors who are in positions where it would be so easy to get steered, right? By the world, certainly, but even by members of their own church, right? Bad actors in the church who are upset with what he's saying or how he's saying it, right? The tone police, all these things that we've been talking about for years now. And there's this tendency for them to misunderstand what it looks like for them to sort of respond, right, in the moment in such a way that they are not giving people a steering wheel that is muzzling the word of God, or they're calling to actually be the one who presents that to the people to lead out as a shepherd and so on and so forth. So it's so helpful in that regard.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things that Friedman actually gave me was like a category for the sort of unself-conscious terrorist.
Yeah.
Like the sort of, because I think part of
define that.
Part of
that's what I was going to ask, whether or not they're actually self-aware and in a mode of milieu, right?
Exactly. So like part of the issue is our doctrine of sin is such that like we make sin the sort of thing that like they have to actually have sat down. If they're sabotaging you, it's because they sat down one day and were like, and they thought about it intentionally and it was pre-planned and all this kind of thing. It's the first degree murder kind of, but premeditation. And so, and most pastors, when they're dealing with people, like those people are out there, but they're actually, that's not your actually biggest problem. It's the one who doesn't look like that. And you go like, this is just how they are. They don't maybe really even fully understand what they're doing. And Friedman gave a category for like that kind of thing in terms of weakness, immaturity, reactive, which is the word reactive is an interesting one.
Right.
And this came later. So I think probably this started showing up in my teaching, probably 2019, it was actually a downstream effect of the empathy conversation. So I was getting so much blowback for the empathy stuff. And one of my students, because I was sin of empathy.
Wow.
And everybody's like, and one of my students said, look, nobody bats an eye when you say sin of anger. even though we know like anger could be good or it could be bad.
That's a great point.
Right. And so, and it was just like a little, penny dropped in my head, and I was like, oh yeah, the passions. Right. And so passions are, good, but can be disordered, especially when they lead and govern. They're not governed by reason, or they're not governed by what's true and good. They become destructive. And so all of a sudden, like when that connection was made, and it was like, oh, what Friedman's calling, then I circle back to Friedman. It's like what he's calling reactive, the Bible calls passions. And you're like, okay, now there's a different vocabulary. And then it was the passions thing that then led me to make the connection to sober-mindedness as the biblical translation of what Friedman calls self-differentiation and non-anxious presence.
That's good.
Because sober-mindedness was just, you're not drunk on your passions. Your passions don't govern you, run you. They're there, but they're shepherded and stewarded towards what's good if you're a faithful leader.
Yeah.
And so it was those kind of things. But it was a student who was just like, hey, nobody bats an eye if we were to talk about the sin of desire. Even though like desire could be good or bad. Sin of sexual desire.
Yeah.
Yeah. But not all sexual desire is sinful.
Right.
I'm not saying all empathy or pity or sympathy or compassion, whatever word you want to use.
Sure.
Is it always sinful? No. But is there a sin of it? Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So go ahead.
I was just thinking I've heard someone say before that even though it's true, there are ditches on either side of this metaphorical road. Whenever you live in a culture that cannot even see that there is a ditch on the other side, it's a great indicator that that's because they're so firmly in the opposite one.
Right.
So if someone can easily see, well, of course, there can be the sin of anger. And I suppose there's a scenario in which they could say, a guy's not sufficiently angry. If a man were assaulting his child and he does nothing about it, we should say there should be righteous anger that drives you to act here. If you can see that, and that's a good sign that at least culturally, you're not so far in one ditch that you're incapable of seeing the other. But if you talk about, well, somebody says, the Bible says, weep with those who weep. And you're saying, well, sure, that's a general statement. But that doesn't mean there's never a scenario in which the person who's weeping isn't weeping over something that they should be weeping about. They're not actually weeping in accordance with what God says is right, true, should be how we should feel about things, and so on and so forth. And you call that the sin of empathy, meaning it's disordered, right? Or it's untethered from truth or something. And then people lose their minds. It's a great indicator that the reason we can't even conceive of erring in this way is because we're so far in the opposite direction that we're very much guilty of the sin that we can't even see.
And that's what Friedman said. He said, even in his day, he knew that empathy had attained this kind of sacred cow status, where if you say a negative word against it, then you were bigoted, hateful, unloving, heartless, all of that sort of word. And then that was one of the things that then led me down to like C.S. Lewis makes the exact same point in Great Divorce. He just calls it the passion of pity, which again, was brought that passion language back in. So he talks, and so Great Divorce has basically all the damned spirits do in that book is try to manipulate the solid spirits who are talking with them. And the most frequent one is kind of the pity party. And so like the Lewis connection, so all of those things kind of dovetailed together. And then like leading with the Shakespeare thing, it was basically, I love Shakespeare. I think people need to be more educated. It's like there's a little bit of like good reasons. Like I'm just like, you know what? Like because when I put it in there, Cannon was like, "Do you really want to start with that though?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I think so." Yeah. Like let's challenge the audience, like have them rise to something. And there've been people who said, "I didn't get what you were talking about there."
Right.
With the crisis of degree, but it was a way of talking about this kind of angsty, anxious, reactive environment that we kind of all swim in. And to get on some, the table, some other things like the scapegoating idea, which I wanted to get in there. It's a Girardian thing that I was trying to bring into the table of when everybody's on edge, eventually all of those passions have to go somewhere, like they need an outlet. And so eventually we just settle on, and it's Jim, it's like we all just kind of, like he became a big target on his back and we expend all that energy on the scapegoat. That's kind of Girard's big theory. And then cover it up. And it was like, oh, that dovetails really nicely with kind of the blame shifting that Friedman talks about as a key marker of this anxious system is that nobody takes responsibility and everybody is constantly blame shifting. So it was those sort of things. And then it kind of all kind of, how I need to get it back to scripture, right? That's the foundation. Like I want to, if I can't show it from the Bible, it may be really helpful, but it stays at the level of like good advice. Mm-hmm. And so it was, teaching through Genesis over and over and over again for college students, that it was like, this progression in the garden, and that shows up again and again with Adam was passive and he abdicated, didn't take responsibility for the task he was assigned by God. And then he commits this great sin, this great idolatry of listening to the voice of his wife and doing what she said rather than what God said. There's idolatry. And then she did it.
Yeah.
The woman you gave me, she did it. And so that passivity, idolatry, blame shift thing was really important. And then I don't remember where I picked this one. I mean, actually, Friedman may have helped because it wasn't in Failure of Nerve, but it's in some other essays. He makes a connection at one point to Aaron at the golden calf.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if I thought of it and then read it and was like, oh yeah, or if that was actually the seed. It could have been the seed. But then it was all of a sudden it kind of like just reoriented that story because one of the things it does is it helps you to like sympathize in a certain kind of way with these characters. You're like, why did Aaron do that? Like they literally got the 10 Commandments 5 minutes ago, and he's like, I guess we should build a golden calf.
Right.
Like how? Like there's a way in which we kind of go, well, I would never do that.
Yeah.
Just like if I was in a perfect garden, I would never eat the fruit that God said not to do. Yeah. And so I would never deny the gospel. I would never do what Peter did. And when you start to see these dynamics, you realize like, oh no, you actually can. Like if you drift, if angsty people, people who have been hurt, traumatized people comes running up to you and like, we're scared. We don't know what happened to that Moses guy who's been our protector and who can turn his staff into a snake to devour the Egyptian, you know what I mean? He can wield death.
Water.
He made water part, and then he's gone.
What are we going to do?
What are we going to do? Give us gods. We're scared.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, Aaron just found their distress too intolerable and said, okay, give me your gold. I'll come up with something.
Right, we need to fix this.
And you can see that he's joining them in their kind of angsty passions. And then and then they commit idolatry. And then here comes Moses down the mountain and says, dude, what? Yeah. And he's like, you know the people.
Right.
The woman you gave me,
Yeah.
right? The people you gave me.
And he also says, we just threw the gold into the fire. It just came out like that.
That's the best part of that story. I was just standing here. Gold went in, calf came out, people started dancing. What do you want me to do?
I know.
It's the same thing. The other one I use in the book is Saul, because I love that one, where God gives him the mission to go wipe out the Amalekites. And then he goes, he keeps the king alive. And it's total war. This is like the wipe them out because of their ancient sin against Israel at the in that wilderness wandering. And so he goes, keeps the king alive, and then keeps all the best stuff for some reason. And then God tells Samuel like he didn't do it. Samuel shows up and Saul literally goes, dude, mission accomplished. I've done what the Lord said. Right. And I just love that Samuel's like, why do I hear sheep?
What is the bleating?
Why are there oxen lowing? And you can just imagine the wheels spinning for Saul going like, oh, we were going to sacrifice.
That's right.
Samuel, you're a big fan of sacrifice. I know. You worked in the temple, right? Yeah, you love sacrifice. We were going to sacrifice. And he says, to the Lord your God, right? Like we were saving this for your God, Samuel, because we know your God. Right. And then he's like, you didn't do it. And eventually Saul gets to the same spot and he's like, I feared the people. Yeah. And so when you start to see that, like it's like that pattern of abdication, idolatry, blame shift shows up enough times. There's a version of it, I think this one isn't in the book, but like David and Bathsheba, it's the same pattern until the end. Mm-hmm. So, you get he should be out with the soldiers. Yep. He should be at war. He's abdication. Right. Then he commits the great sin, and then doubles down on it. So gets her pregnant and then kills Uriah. And then at that moment, so he's 2 steps in. There's one more, which is blaming. Mm-hmm. And so the really gnarly version of that story is when Nathan shows up and says, you did this. And he goes, Bathsheba made me. Right? Like she did it. And instead he says, you're right, I've sinned against the Lord. Right. And so he actually finally takes responsibility and repents. And there's still consequences, and the fire goes out of the kingdom at some level, like his kids go off the rails and everything else. So like there's real consequences, but he did repent and was restored to Christ. And so like this is a story that God is like, you have to get this. You have to get this. And so I really wanted, in addition to the Friedman turned me on to some things, helped me to see some stuff. But then it's like the Bible is going to be the thing that both really puts a like laser focus and then shows us the way out.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were talking, it occurred to me that, some people who may have read your book even as they're listening to you talk now, might say, well, why couldn't you just, you mentioned fear of man. Why couldn't you just talk about that, right? Why did you have to use Friedman at all? I mean, you probably have gotten questions like this before. And I don't know how you answer that. I'd be curious to hear how you do. But one of the thoughts that occurred to me, even as you were talking, was that it's an old preaching adage about the importance of making the strange a bit more familiar, but also of making the familiar strange, so that something that people have heard their entire life just kind of goes one in one ear and out the other. Doesn't do that anymore. So if you just talked about fear of man, only talked about cowardice and that sort of thing, then people would say, yeah, I've got that. I got that. I know, fear the Lord, don't fear man. But and all the while, they're actually being steered in all these ways by a dynamic of the fear of man, but they wouldn't recognize it because they've just, they're reading with blinders on in a way. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Would you say that the churches are more prone, given the nature of the social institution that is the church, than other kind of social makeups? Is this a unique challenge to the church itself?
In terms of like the language piece, like, or what?
Well,
like,
just in terms of people's resiliency and not being able to see these types of things. Why is the church in particular more blind possibly than businesses in the marketplace, certain other social settings?
I think part of the reason that churches in particular were susceptible, and the reason that I keyed in on this like empathy thing, is because the Bible does say stuff like be kind and tenderhearted.
Right.
It puts a major emphasis on compassion and mercy as marks, fruits of the Spirit, as things that are like Christians are obligated to do. Like, these are really, really good things modeled for us by our Lord and commended to us over and over and over and over again. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Like, these sort of commands then mean Christians should be kind. Christians should be kind. We've been catechized into that, which then, this was again a thing I learned from Lewis. The best virtues become the worst vices. Right.
Okay,
It's the Four Loves. The whole principle of his book, The Four Loves, is the greater the good it is, the more awful it is when it goes wrong. That's why Lucifer's an archangel and he becomes the devil. You don't. And so in this case, love for the hurting, compassion is a great and glorious good, which is why when it goes bad, it goes real bad. And so I think that's part of why Christians are that particular piece was so effective at steering Christians. Yeah, I'd say that one, and then the other one, and this shows up a little bit in there, but it's going to be expanded in the sequel. Which is more like a prequel, I guess. Technically, it's actually more deep dive on that problem. It's both the empathy, compassion piece that gets twisted, but also the reputation. Christians have a good testimony, good reputation with outsiders, those sort of ideas, which again are commands, but then kind of get untethered from other biblical realities, like they're going to lie about you. They're going to say false things about you. Remember that Jesus was executed as a blasphemer. And so that Paul was accused of all manner of sins, big and small. Like, he's a showboat. He's he's using you. He's in it for the money. Like, all of the reputational things that Paul is constantly having to fight off. And then we're like, but if people say bad things about us, that must be all our fault. And it's like, well,
we weren't winsome enough. We weren't polite enough. We weren't kind enough. We weren't soft enough. We weren't gentle enough. And so when you take all those pieces and you put them together, you say, that can't be true unless you want to suggest that means Jesus was guilty of not having a good reputation with outsiders. So that taking those things and setting them alongside each other forces you to think a little more deeply about what that phrase means and what it doesn't mean. What it can't mean, unless you want to implicate Christ in sin, which no Christian wants to do.
Right. And I think that, like you mentioned earlier, like the steering wheel image was one. I don't remember at what point it came to me, and maybe the word steering showed up somewhere in Failure of Nerve. It's possible. And it just, the image stuck in my head. And so it has become kind of the main way that when I unpack it, is like, picture, you got a steering wheel on your back and somebody's going to grab it, and your reputation is one steering wheel and your compassion is another steering wheel. And there's more steering wheels than that. But those are two big ones, especially in the last decade, that people got a hold of in order to hijack the agenda. I think that was another thing that Friedman really accented. It was like the antidote was this like well-differentiation, which really comes from waking up in the morning, knowing who you are and what you're about. And you hear a lot of guys talk about, in a church context, like mission clarity, Businesses talk the same way. Like you got to know what the mission is and what the mission isn't. Like what is mission creep? What's taking you off? And this idea of like sabotage is basically any attempt to derail you from whatever it is that God's called you and the institution that you're over to do. So a family has a mission, a church has a mission, a school has a mission, a business has a mission. All of these have tasks, duties, responsibilities assigned to them by God. And the attempt to get you to do something other than that is sabotage. That word is Cannon actually was the one who really said, let's lean into that word as kind of the one. And they were really like wise to do so. And so sabotage and steering became kind of these two really big, potent concepts that I think for a lot of people have like resonated. They've been like, that's what happened to me.
So let's say somebody's listening, this is their first exposure to this, and they've heard us say emotional sabotage.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that sometimes it can be subtle. It can come from people who are being well-meaning. How might someone know they're bumping up against emotional sabotage in their family, the church, or the world? What would be some first signs?
Yeah. So like I say this all the time, the most actionable piece of like practical wisdom I give in the book is learning to pay attention to your own passions, your own hesitations, reluctances, blow-ups, like when you start to feel your dander get up, like we usually hide it. We say I'm frustrated because that sounds better than saying I'm angry. Right. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. I'm not angry. I'm frustrated.
Right. I've got another 3 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We sanitize these things. So it's like, it's not fear, I'm nervous, or I'm anxious actually is another one. I'm not sad, I'm depressed. Like we have all these other terms that we use that kind of, again, there's this interesting, I think one of the things that actually happened with the whole sin of empathy discourse war was what I did that you shouldn't do is I did bring a term that's very in vogue in sort of psychological therapeutic literature. And I paired it with a hardline moral word. And it was like, so people, whenever, like one of the biggest objections I had whenever that was the big conversation was, no, what you're talking about is enmeshment. And I'm like, that's a psychological word that gets people off the hook. It's a perfectly fine word. Actually, like it's a really good image of like the entanglement that people can have. That Friedman used. Yeah, exactly. The fusion of personalities that C.S. Lewis describes as basically what hell is. Melted down into your master, and this kind of decomposition where you're fused and devoured by another. And so I'm like, I can run with those words, but just the word sin is a moral word. And so when I paired it with this psychological word, it like jarred for people. And I think that's, again, one of the things that Friedman was missing at some level because he wasn't a Christian and didn't, I mean, he, like you said, he may have had a concept of evil, but like, did he think of things as like, he believed in God of some source, but it's sort of like the same way that like Jordan Peterson kind of believes in God.
Very similar,
you know what I mean? It's actually like a very similar sort of thing, like the great principle of the universe to which we are always striving or something.
These great Old Testament stories.
Yes, that like the Jungian archetypes.
Exactly.
And I'm like, no, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit who created you and, command you to worship him. Like that God, you violated his law, and that's the sin. And whatever your excuses are, it doesn't matter, like that you're guilty. And so that I think is part of what caused people to react so strongly.
Yeah. Well, as you were talking, I was thinking one of the in an emotional milieu in which feelings essentially are normalized, but also unreflectively. The guy who points out the steering wheel actually exists. Is the one who gets in trouble.
Yes.
And it says, actually, there is a steering wheel. There's a reason why things are moving the way they do. And there's a lot of people jockeying for position. But the guy who points it out is actually the one. I think you mentioned that in the book is actually the one who's not causing the problem, just points out the problem.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it kind of
And I think this is actually, so you asked earlier, how do you know if it's happening? It's the hesitations and reluctances. And then it's where the accusations start to fly. So basically, part of Friedman's point is if you have an anxious system, reactive, passions are coursing through it, hurting, social stampedes, if that's a blame shifting.
You say in your book, there's the crackle.
There's like crackle in the air. Yeah, exactly. Everybody feels it. If you try to be a sober-minded leader and, respond, not react, to be deliberate and to not be swept away, it's a good bet that everybody who's immersed in that is going to take it out on you. You're going to be the problem because you're not going along with where everybody's trying to steer or whoever they're trying to accommodate. And so if you just refuse to go along, you're the troubler of Israel.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And so I think that's another way that you can see, like, well, think about it. In your most sober-minded moments, when you're trusting in God and you're doing the right thing, and then everybody gets mad at you,
Right.
you're in it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like it's like that's a good sign that like you're in there. Now, if you blow up and everybody gets upset at you, you're part of the problem. You were another emotional domino, and you just, all of the angst kind of landed on you, and you just fed it back into the system, but louder.
So we saw this play out in our church at a very small scale. By God's grace, it wasn't a big thing, but a number of years ago, there was a couple in our church who reached out to one of their neighbors, who was not a Christian, invited him to church, and he came. And what they didn't know is the man, when he came, decided to dress as a woman. So he came in a dress, makeup, the whole thing, and came out for a number of weeks. And at one point, started sending us emails demanding to use the women's restroom, and if we would please tell everybody to use, feminine pronouns. And so we very, very kindly said, we're not going to do that. Then he demanded to have a meeting, with the church. We're like, we're not going to do that either, but some of the pastors will sit down and talk with you. So what we did, and we just very calmly, incredibly kindly, patiently said, hey, listen, nobody has at once told you to stop wearing a dress. Not yet. I mean, the guy he's not a believer. So we're trying to meet him where he's at and see what happens if the gospel can take root, these kinds of things. But we did put a hard line down on, you're not going to use a woman's restroom. We're not going to use female pronouns to refer to you because we can't lie to you. We're not allowed to do that. Or God tells us we literally have to speak the truth in love. And that's what we're doing here today. And then the accusations came first, of course, from him without doubt. So he leaves, says we're all godless. We don't know his God, which is an ironic statement. Very ironic, right? But beyond that, then there were a couple people after he was gone for a few weeks. They said, what happened to so-and-so? And I said, well, we just kindly explained that you couldn't use a restroom. We weren't going to use pronouns or whatever. And I remember somebody said in an offhanded way to me, that's a shame. I just wonder if we had accommodated him, if maybe given him a longer chance to hear the gospel, that kind of thing. And like I said, it didn't blow up. It didn't become a big thing. But I thought about that experience as I was reading your book, because I was like, if we had done that, we actually would have not helped this man see the place where he does need to repent, or the gospel can't come to him. I mean, repent and believe the gospel. If we're literally shoring off the edges of where the Lord is trying to show him where he's out of line and where he needs to repent, and we do this as an accommodating mood, as a sympathetic move, as a, well, maybe we can calm things down or whatever. So it was interesting to watch this dynamic play out at the time. I didn't have a name for it, didn't have a category for it, but it's very much what was going on in a microcosm. And
it would have introduced, the other thing it would have done, so it would have been bad for him, but what it would have done to your church is what you're working into the sort of, Friedman would have said, like the germ DNA, or like what you're working to the operating system of your church is the way to get your way.
That's right.
Is to hold everybody hostage.
That's right.
Like that's how, if you want to drive, just hold everybody hostage. They'll give in.
Yep.
And so you would incentivize more of it. And I think that's one of the things that actually happened over the last 10 years is people did kind of make that calculation and think, well, maybe if we just give in a little, then they'll come our way. And it's like, well, if you're the one who's giving in simply because they're not moving, guess which way you're going to move.
That's right.
You've actually moved to them.
You're moving towards them. And you say, isn't that, and this is where, again, pious desires for people to come to know Jesus can get hijacked, because it's like, well, didn't Jesus go for the lost? He came to seek and save what was lost. Right. And he called them to repentance. Like he said, you have to leave that. Go and sin no more. Sorry. Right. Yes, he loved them. And some of them hated him for it. Like he got crucified because he was calling them to repent. So I do think that there were a lot of potential steering wheels that I don't think the church was fully ready for. Some people ask, anything you wish you would have done differently? And I'm like, well, the Southern Baptists wish I would have written it about 4 years ago. So I have that happen a lot. They're like, this would have been great. Like back in 2018, 2019, we really wish we would have had this. And I'm like, sorry guys, I didn't.
Wind time machines are
I
invented.
I wasn't there yet.
I think you mentioned, I don't know if it was in the book, but essentially social media being, digital technologies being an extreme catalyst to expedite these things. So normative kind kind of milieus, if you will, environments in which resiliency to this type of activity. You think the family, at least I'm a little bit older at this point, so some of those things were obvious lessons you learn with kids.
Yeah.
You're teaching them how to get their way when you constantly accommodate in ways that are not tethered to actually what's for their good. Mm-hmm. But those things seem to also have been collectively, they're not as prominent by a long shot as they used to be. In fact, missing them many times. So it makes it very difficult for folks to diagnose this is actually what's happening.
Yeah, there's a whole mindset now that says, it's psychologically harmful to tell your child no.
Right.
And so you should never do that. And I remember watching a family who was in town visiting a member of our church. So they're not part of our church, but they were visiting and they were hanging out at our house. And my wife had lit some candles for dinner. And their toddler kept trying to touch the fire. And they wouldn't tell him no. They just kept saying, hot, hot. Look over here. It was
trying to distract him.
Yeah. It was really sad because it's the kind of thing, and we can laugh at that particular story, but it's the kind of thing that if you did that over the course of a child's entire life, then really the child is actually, the real lesson they're learning is if they keep at it with persistence, mom and dad will give in and they'll eventually get whatever it is that they were after. And if what they were after isn't good for them, then you actually haven't helped them at all.
Or you normalize the herding mentality. Essentially, you teach them how to actually be herded. Yeah. And they become part of the larger herd that essentially is not basing on reality, but just herding in a different direction.
Yeah, it's interesting too. When it comes to the family piece, I've had a lot of pastors come up to me afterward and like, man, we read your book and felt like, are you a Fed? Do you have a microphone in our church or something? Because how did how did you know? And I was like, guys, I've been around. But the other big group that has kind of come up has been people in their families. Usually it's, people who are grown and they've got siblings or parents or grandparents or those sort of relationships in which these kind of dynamics are very alive and well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the sort of bonus features that we did for the book was Friedman wrote these fables.
Yeah.
Like a book called Friedman's Fables, in which he kind of takes a lot of his concepts and tries to tell these like little Aesop's fables type stories. Yeah. And so Cannon said, hey, let's have you and Doug talk about a couple of them. Mm-hmm. And so we did these like 4 parts on Friedman's Fables. And I get tons of feedback about that because those, and mainly because the sorts of things he's talking about show up in families. Mm-hmm. Is there's that one family member who everybody walks on eggshells around and is always trying to accommodate. Yeah, right. And so you're talking about little kids where families can do that to little kids, but a lot of times it's like it might be mom. Yeah. Right, everybody's just don't let mom or don't set dad off. Or if you say that so and so is going to take their ball and go home. Yeah. And basically what's happening there is that the entire family begins to like orbit around the most immature and reactive member of the family, and everybody's miserable. And the minute you say, you know what, I don't think I'm gonna, I'm just not gonna do that anymore. I'm not gonna accommodate. I'm gonna say, like Friedman would, say, that behavior is unacceptable. Like, I'm not going to do it. The person that will get, called on the carpet is you. This is you're the trouble of Israel again, right? You're the wire. And I think the sort of thing that I've also encountered in this, and this is church context and everything else, is part of what you have to do if you try to implement it. If you were to read the book and go, man, this seems like I'm in a situation like this, and you said, all right, I'm going to try to be sober-minded. I'm going to have, fear the Lord, not man. I'm going to get grounded in the gospel, and then I'm going to lean in, and I'm going to try to get this to go a better direction. I'm just like, hey, brother, it's going to go bad. Like, it's going to go, you're not going to like it. And it becomes hard because what everybody does is they scapegoat you. You're the problem. Right. Elijah's the trouble of Israel. And it's like, so the confusion comes is that you were the occasion. They think you're the cause of the problem. That's right. When you were the occasion for revealing the problem. Right. And it's that confusion. And it's hard when everybody's telling you that. Yeah. And then, if you're married and your wife's going like, did we cause this? Did you cause this? And you just have to be like, have a clear conscience before the Lord and say, I didn't. I just said what was true. Everybody lost their minds. I get it. Yeah. Like me saying, so at one level, I said this, everybody lost their minds. So in that sense, I caused it. But the problem was that saying truth caused people to lose their minds. That's right. Like that's the actual problem. Right. And that's not on me, that's on them. And I actually am going to refuse to take the blame for it.
That's right. So back to that, the trans man example. Yeah. The problem wasn't that we were unwilling to accommodate. The problem was that this guy's profoundly confused
Yes.
about who he is, about who God is, about how he's supposed to be living his life. And when we just calmly explain that, we become, in the eyes of a couple people, him and one other, the problem. Because, well, why didn't you just meet somebody where they're at? Why weren't you more kind? Why weren't you more patient? Why weren't you more accommodating, and so on and so forth? I mean,
Well, this is also, I mean, to that illustration a little bit, this is also why we didn't have a riot in the church.
correct.
Because a strong milieu takes considerable amount of effort and time to build strength.
Yep.
Whereas a weak milieu also takes a similar amount of time to build a thoroughly weak institution.
Yeah.
So pastors that are listening to this, leaders, they read it, they go in there and get fired the next day if they think they'll implement it. Quick fix.
Yeah.
So, and you mentioned quick fix in there.
Yeah.
So what are some steps to?
What's interesting is I always thought one of the interesting pieces of advice when I was reading through Friedman early was that he said whenever he would go into a organization that had him come consult, maybe you could concentrate two different approaches. One is, hey, let's go in and do a bunch of surveys about employee satisfaction and try to, we just need to data mine this. Let's just get all of this information.
Right.
And so I didn't talk about that aspect as much in the book, but like he says, that impulse to kind of try to find the answer in data and technique. Right. Like what's the, if we can figure out what other levers to buttons to push.
It's a knowledge problem.
Yeah, it's a knowledge problem, and we just don't know what buttons to push. He says that's evidence of a quick fix, reactive mentality, and it actually I think is related to the blame displacement, because then if you get all the data and you make a call based on the data, you have something to point at when everything doesn't work.
That's right.
If it doesn't work, you can say, but this is what the data said.
That's right.
And so it's not my fault. Whereas if you say, I think I'm just going to take a decisive action that's going to bring clarity, it still might go sideways.
Right.
But now it's on you. Like the responsibility is going to be like, yeah, you did say it. And you're like, yeah, I did. And it was necessary to say it. The flip side there is what he said, what he would do in those organizations is he wouldn't do the data mining. He would come in and relatively quickly try to ascertain of the people here, who is the most basically mature, who's the one most willing to take responsibility for themselves. And he would just say, I'm only working with that person.
Yep.
And he would, like everybody else, you guys go back to work.
Yep.
I'm going to talk to Bill. And Bill could be like the middle manager. He might not even be the boss. And he would go to Bill and he would be like, look, there's going to be times where the herd's going to try to get you to do something. You just have to say no.
Yeah.
And it was all kind of trying to steel him against the inevitable sabotage. And so and the idea was to kind of form the nucleus, a healthy nucleus of you take responsibility for you and you don't take responsibility for everybody else's insanity and reactions. And then other mature people will gravitate to that, and you can begin to form the nucleus of an alternative operating system. That was his approach. And so I've said that to people and when they've advised, I'm in this situation, I'd say, look, your goal shouldn't first be, how do I change my church? How do I change my elder team? It's you don't get changed by it.
Well, that's good.
Like that's like the first thing is you or your family. You're going. So when I do premarital counseling, and people get newly married, and there's this tension. The leave and cleave thing kind of comes up here because it's, when I'm with my new spouse, we're great. We're trying to get things launched, but then we go home for Christmas. And I kind of revert back and kind of start to fall back in, and people, your wife's going like, why are you acting that way? Why do you act that way when you go back with your family? And it's like, because you're falling back into that operating system. So I always tell newly married couples, you're going to go home and your goal is not to fix your family. Your goal is to come out on the other side as your family.
Well, that's good.
Right? Like endure it. So that may mean there's hard conversations. It may mean that it gets a little bit dicey, that you pull some things out. You don't go in and blow it up. You don't have to do that. Be kind, but don't, if somebody throws a pity party, you don't go along with it. Establish a different operating system. And it's really hard, because a lot of our problem is we just have a really low tolerance for emotional pain, ours and others. Like that discomfort. It's like Friedman makes this point. He says, we will almost always choose long-term chronic pain over short-term acute pain. Like, it's like, it's the sort of quintessential, the guy who's like, man, my shoulder's been hurting for like a year and a half. You've been to the doctor? No. The doctor says I need surgery. Why would I go back to him? It's like, we might fix it. And it's like, but we'll choose long-term chronic accommodating pain and just limp rather than let's just fix it. Could we fix it? And I think that there's a lot of, that's what happens in families. That's what happens in churches, is we'll just kind of limp along and try to make it work, as opposed to clarity and then endure the fallout.
One of the short-term, as you're calling them, acute pains that you talk about a good deal toward the end of the book is resolving to, or be aware that you will be called names.
Yeah.
That's one of the primary ways that the devil works through people to steer others, right? Yep. Is to call you something you're not. So you talked about the importance of not being what they say you are.
Yes.
I mean, 1 Peter 4 says the same thing. Jesus implies that in Matthew 5 when he says the prophets were slandered for these things, and the implication is, but we know they weren't. Right. So rejoice when this happens. I remember reading an article that Reese Laverty wrote about a year and a half ago. So Reese, I know you know him, for our listeners, Reese works with Ad Fontes magazine and Davenant Press and those guys. And he wrote an article that was called something like, what did you think you would be hated for? And he was just pointing out, he's about our age, and he was pointing out that, you know, when coming up in the 80s and 90s, people would talk about the world hating you because John 15's in the Bible. Everybody loves John. So you read John 15 and Jesus says the world's going to hate you because it hated him. So that's in there. It's in your mental landscape. It's in there somewhere, coming, right? You know this. But the breakdown was that we've now shifted into whether you want to call it negative world, whatever you want to call it. We've shifted into a landscape now where Christians are some of the last people who still believe in things that everybody believed because of common grace 50 years ago. Just basic stuff like 2 + 2 really does equal 4 and it only equals 4. A man really is a man. A woman really is a woman. Marriage really is only for a man and a woman because their parts fit together and no other combinations work. Right? And so the thing he was pointing out in this article was you grew up hearing that you would be hated, and you thought that meant you would be hated for believing that Jesus is God, that people need a savior, that hell is real, and that you're going there unless you repent and believe the gospel. He's like, well, that part's still true. But the new thing that we're having to deal with, which I thought your book was sort of a lovely compliment to, was you need to know you're going to be hated for a lot more than that. You're going to be called a misogynist if you actually believe that God called men to lead their families. You're going to be called a racist if you say 2 + 2 = 4 for everybody, not just for
That's not a white thing.
It's not a white thing, right? And you say these kinds of things. People are going to say things about you, and the importance that you pointed out in your book was you got to know it's coming, and you got to be resolved ahead of time to know. Just laugh about that stuff and say, I know that's not true. There's part of you that knows that's not true, even though you're in deep denial and confusion. Otherwise, that is how you get steered, isn't it?
Yeah, there's an element of like one game you should play is you should try to figure out what's the worst thing that they could call me. Like not like
the thing you're most afraid of.
The thing that I'm most afraid of. Like if I had a reputation for something, what would be the thing that I do not want to have a reputation for? Figure out what that is, and just know as soon as your enemies figure out what that is what they are going to call you.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's different for everybody, because like you said, I do think that I think a lot of pastors during this last 10 years were in principle ready. Like if they hate us because of Jesus, by which they meant cross resurrection, then I'm ready for it. But if they hate us because we enable abuse, if that's the accusation, it's like, well, I don't want to be hated for that.
Right.
And it's like, no, you don't want that to be true.
Correct.
But like, if they figure out that, you know what, if we say you're a Christo-fascist who believes that Jesus is the only way, and that's bigoted, there's a whole bunch of pastors I know that would be like, yeah, we do. You know what? Yeah. That's just the gospel. But if they get accused of being a racist or an abuse enabler, all of a sudden it's like, well, I will do anything to not be called that.
Yeah.
And so
then all of a sudden your sermon's on Ephesians 5, instead of teaching, hey, this is what God says, wives submit to your husbands and everything or whatever, it immediately becomes a sermon that's just worried about that audience. Right. And the whole time you spend up talking about that, saying this is not abuse. And in fact, abuse is horrible, which it is, by the way, but it's not even mentioned in Ephesians 5. So you end up instead of preaching what God actually says, you're constantly preaching to the people because they've actually controlled the conversation at that point, and you're not even aware that this is going on.
Yeah. So for pastors, the test I always do, this is the running test, is where I say, look, okay, you're asked to preach on marriage, and you only got one sermon to do it next weekend, and your elder team gives you the choice of text, and they say you can either preach husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church, or wives submit to your husbands the way Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. You get to pick your text. Which one are you going to choose?
Yeah, everybody's going to.
And every pastor goes like, I know which one I would do. That's right. Yeah. And even if they would say, well, no, I do whichever. Are we preaching through 1 Peter? I just preach that. Yeah. And it's like, wait, which one are you going to preach straight down the middle?
Right.
Like which one are you going to preach just right in the middle, and which one are you going to bury under acres of nuance and qualification, because you're mindful of certain dangers or certain temptations. Right. And I'm not always saying that like that's like there may be good reasons why you may know of people in your church that need to hear that word, but it would be about you pastoring that flock, not you trying to appease the accusers. And so like I remember, and one of the ways I actually encourage pastors to like work through this with their congregation is to actually overtly talk about it. So one time when I was still pastoring in Minnesota, we were preaching through 1 Peter, and we got to 1 Peter 5, shepherd the flock of God that's among you. And so I'm preaching on what pastors are supposed to do. And I was writing, and I wanted to say that elders rule the church. And every time I typed it, it would be like elders, LEAD, the church. Like I could feel this is what I mean. You have to learn to pay attention to your impulses and instincts. And it was like, I wanted to say the word rule, but I kept I could feel the default to I want to say the word lead instead. Yep, right. And you're like, what's wrong with the word lead? Perfectly good word. Book's called leadership, right? I didn't call it rulership in Emotional Sabotage, though that would have been lit. Maybe we sold less. Yes, right. Yeah, right. But what did I do? Is I interrogated, why am I reluctant to use this word? It's a Bible word, let elders who rule well, they're worthy of double honor. So it's in the Bible. Why am I not wanting to describe the eldership task using that terms? And so then I interrogate it, and I start thinking, okay, some of it was Ravi Zacharias had just, that whole thing had just blown up. Right. And I was mindful of people are really nervous about abusive leaders right now. And it's okay, that's a good reason to be worried. That's okay. We don't want people to think that leaders can do whatever they want. But it was also that's all of that's a media environment where pastoral failures are magnified, because everybody, when he does stuff like that, that's going to be in the news. But when normal pastor does, Friday family fun night for the third week in a row, that's not in the news. It's not in the news. And so it's there's a hypersensitivity because scandal sells. Sure. So it's and do I want to lean into that, or do I want to, abuse isn't in the passage. This is just normal marriage. This is just husbands love your wives, wives submit to your husbands. That's just to be the most normal thing in the world. That's how God designed it. So let's just preach the way it should be. And so I started interrogating, why do I feel this way? What's the reluctance coming from? And then what I did on Sundays, I just got up and I just talked through that. And I just said, this is why. And then I asked myself this, and then I tried to show them it was you don't do this a lot, but how the sausage was made, because I wanted them to see hey, as your pastor, because the point of the passage was shepherd the flock of God that's among you, your people. And so if I am aware that certain people in this congregation might be upset if I preach it straight down the middle, I'm actually not shepherding the flock of God. I'm accommodating the flock of God. That's right. The fears and sensitivities and sins that are in this room, I'm not talking about those. And it's amazing how you can build a church always talking about the other guy's sins.
That's right.
The sins across town, the sins over there. And there's a reason for that. You should do that. People are going to have to live in the world. So you should prepare them. But if you're doing that at the expense of preaching to the sins in the room, you're not being faithful.
Yeah. Yeah. It exposes that actually you have an emotionally coddling environment.
Yeah.
So you might say the book itself has functioned as a well-differentiated book.
Yeah,
because it kind of is the book that stands up and says, well, this is the hypocrisy in the room that's actually happening.
This is really what it is.
This is really what actually is going on. And it exposes, even the whole John conversation a few minutes ago about Christians always affirming, maybe in positive world, yes, we're going to suffer for Christ. But it was never any experiential aspect of that.
Right.
It's still hypothetically.
It's theoretical.
All of a sudden now we live in times where this is experiential.
Or at the very least, it would be you're a weirdo because you believe in a resurrection or something. It would be the extent of it would be oh, you still believe those old stories? That's kind of silly. But it's school, playground kind of taunts that. Mm-hmm. It's not I don't want to be called an abuse enabler. Good grief. Right. And I think that a lot of guys, part of the reason they got sometimes in scenarios where churches blew up because of accusations against a pastor that turned out not to be true, and elders went along with it, even though they knew that it wasn't true. That's not okay. Yeah, this was just a tangle. This wasn't what it's being made out to be,
Right.
is because no one wanted to be the silent elder when things went belly up. And so it was like, if we're going to err on the side of like, let's get the guy.
Yeah.
Like, let's be more careful, as opposed to let's actually pursue justice. What actually happened? Did this actually happen, or is it fabricated? And the sort of churches that were able to resist the impulse to blow things out of proportion, or it could go the other way. One of the things, I mentioned already once this one's the new one,
The new prequel.
the new prequel. So there's a section in there on the the empathy stuff.
Is that a cloud hugging a bomb?
It's a cloud hugging a bomb.
That's fantastic.
Cannon's really good. So Cannon's the one who came up with the monster on sabotage. He's great. I've thought if I could figure out how to make plush, little, dolls or whatever of the monster and the cloud, I'd be very wealthy. I think that they would go. I think that like every people
Bobbleheads.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so Sin of Empathy, that's coming out in into February. So maybe that's when this podcast will be out. But basically, it's the taking that piece of it and pulling it out. I've been talking about it a lot. I reworked a lot of the content that I've done over the years into this one. But I think that was a big part of what guys were afraid of, is like, I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
And so we're not gonna pursue strict justice. We're not gonna try to figure out what happened. And the churches that did that just inflamed it, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and made a big mess.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you mentioned in the book as well, this is, we tend to focus on these strong examples of an abusive leader who blows things up. But those tend to be more of not the norm, actually. You have more passivity through slow death, actually, in a lot of these churches, in which a lot of these types of failures are being committed.
Right.
So normally you gravitate and say, oh, it was this particular type of person, the abusive, strong, overbearing leader is the one we're running out. But in reality, what's more normative is gross passivity.
Yeah.
Right.
Through
Abdication. And
Right.
weakness.
So abuse makes the news, but abdication never does.
Right.
I remember talking with a guy right after the Rise and Fall of the Mars Hill podcast came out.
Right.
There was a guy who works for a national, very large, very well-funded evangelical organization who asked me what I thought about it. And I said, I don't know how much time we have, so I don't know if you want all those thoughts, but the shortest thought I could have on it is it's identifying a real problem categorically that even in some cases that the show wants to assign it to wasn't actually true. Like the famous line where Mark Driscoll, who's pastoring at Mars Hill, screams and he asks men, "Who the hell do you think you are?" So that clip gets taken and run on the show as an example of abuse. The irony is, of course, in context, he was yelling at men who were hitting their girlfriends.
Right.
And he was saying, how dare you do this? And so I was like, that's funny. It's actually, he was doing the opposite thing that you guys are accusing him of. So that's problem one. But the much bigger problem was, the main takeaway from anybody who listened to it was, my gosh, most of the leaders I know are probably abusive leaders. And in reality, it's far, far and away the other way around. Right. 90 to 10 in the other direction, at least, that the vast majority of leaders are so far away from being abusive that when you put out something like that, is exceedingly dangerous, very sneaky. The enemy loves that kind of stuff because he uses it to convince people that guys who are actually leading in the ways that the scriptures would call them to lead are probably guilty of abuse, or at least enabling abuse. And in reality, if they were doing anything other than the kind of leading they're doing, they would actually be abdicating the responsibilities the Lord's given to them.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I talk about is the way that concepts like abuse during that 10-year period, kind of the language inflation, concept creep settled in to where this term that had a fairly defined meaning kind of became enlarged to someone who disagreed with me.
Yeah,
that's right.
And so the potency of the word, and I don't want to be called that. And I think even things like, I wasn't at Mars Hill, I don't know whatever happened.
Sure.
But the point is, one of the effects of it was nobody wanted to be the quiet elder at Mars Hill when everything was going down.
Yeah.
And so like fear of that meant we'll go along with all manner of nonsense lest we be accused of enabling it or doing it. And one of the ironies of this is, I talk about this in the new one, abusers are very adept at manipulating people's empathy.
Yes.
Like that's actually like highly empathetic environments are actually like an abuser's playground, because it's if it's like, oh, somebody's sad, we have to accommodate them. Then it's they do the bad thing and then, hey, don't tell anybody. Right. I'll get in so much trouble.
I'll get fired.
You don't, and they become very adept at manipulating people based on like, this misplaced empathy.
Right.
And so it's like, I'm saying, in any given situation, did he do it? Did he not? The point is the emotions can't run the show. Just the feelings aren't in charge. The truth's in charge. Like what actually happened. Like God designed us for God over our minds and our minds over our passion. That's how it should be ordered. And we invert it. God's out of the picture, and then the feelings lead the way.
Yeah, that's right.
And we just get tossed, and it's who has the best, who gets the steering wheel first.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm interested in this. We're now 5 days into new administration.
Yeah.
We've seen like 452 executive orders.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. These pens are breaking.
I know. So at least culturally in America, it looks like some things are changing that are not going to be true in the next 4 years that were when you were writing both of these books.
Right.
Because you were still writing that before the election. So how do you hope your books will be used maybe as culture makes a little bit of a shift?
Yeah. So I think right now people talk about the vibe shift. And I just want to say, like, all it is a vibe shift. Yeah. That's what vibe is, another word for mood, and moods are transient. And so unless you actually do things, so the vibe shift matters because it can give momentum, but it's actually action that does things. And so at this point, I don't think, Elon tweeted a couple weeks ago that the woke mind virus has been deleted. And I'm like, is feminism still around?
Right.
Because if it is, it's not been deleted. The woke mind virus runs on feminism. That's the first, bulwark that it captured. And so as long as like the Republican Party is boasting at how many women they have in office, I'm like, it's not been deleted. It's just gone underground, and it's retreating a little bit because it's trying to catch the lay of the land. And so I don't think, I think I'm grateful for all the things that are being done, but it's, will we have the stamina to actually, like, there's going to be a backlash, right? It's not like the left or the progressives or the woke are all of a sudden going to go, well, I guess Trump won and we lost, so maybe we should just call it a day, everybody. Like, so I'll go home. I guess Christian nationalism it is. Let's just do it. Like, that's not going to happen.
Right.
And even the Trump administration isn't, fully where we want it to be. Like, I'll believe that there's actually like a counter movement when Obergefell's overturned. Then I'll be like, okay, now that's a shift.
Yeah. Right.
But like, but if you talk that way right now, it's like, oh no, don't bring that up. And it's like, oh, I know what we have to talk about.
Sure.
I know what's next. And so I think we just, Christians ought to be sober-minded about this and be ready for the backlash, celebrate the wins, be grateful for it. I think that folks who made the calculation that he's going to be a substantially better president than she would have been should feel very vindicated right now as pro-life protesters are being let out of jail. The border's getting actions actually being done there. The federal government has defined man and woman rightly and from conception. Like, all of these things are major wins. We should celebrate them, and then we should use them as opportunities to take another step, like keep moving the ball forward. And really, for me, when I think about this, the long-term fruit is going to first show up in homes and churches.
Sure.
Like there will be, like, I think public leaders, guys who are having to deal with big controversy will get benefit from a lot of it and things like that. But it's healthy homes, homes where mom and dad get along, where dad is a faithful head, where mom is a faithful body, and the kids follow in that train. Like, that's going to be the real test. Sure. So when people come up and say like, hey, our family's kind of a mess, and like, I'm now taking responsibility. Like, I know it's mine. Yeah. Then I'm like, that's the huge win.
That is good.
I say a lot that, one of the things, I think it came actually late. I don't think it was in the first like lectures I did. I don't think it was, but I put it in there because it settled in on me in a fresh way. Was Job. One of the reasons he was righteous and blameless was that, his grown kids are throwing parties, and every morning he's getting up and offering sacrifices on their behalf,
just in case
they had sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Right. And the lesson I take is not, I'm going to go slaughter a goat tomorrow morning. We don't do that in the New Covenant. But but the common thing that we still should do is he's the head of his home. He's the head. and he's taking responsibility for his family. He's going before God and saying, God, what happens in my kids' hearts is under my care. I can't control it. If they sin, their sin is their sin. They'll stand before you and have to answer for it. But I'll have to answer for how I shepherded this home and whether or not I took responsibility. So it's just like a regular habit that I try to get in, especially when there's challenges. There's things in my house. I'm trying to figure out how to, you've got teenagers, I got little guys. When I'm doing that and I'm like, I don't really know what to do right now.
Yeah.
The first thing is, Lord, I just want you to know this is my problem. I'm the head. I'm responsible for this. And so please help me to know what the next step is, which I think is the antidote to kind of the quick fix, let's get the data.
Right.
Sober-minded leaders can course correct because you go like, all right, I don't know everything, but what's the thing that God says to do? Well, trust him, and then do what? Obey. So I'm going to trust and obey. I'm going to take a step. And if I flub it, if I make a mistake, that was unwise, well, it's no big deal. Jesus forgives. Right. I can course correct. But when you have this mentality of if we make a mistake, everything blows up and it's the end of the world, then you'll never move. You'll just be paralyzed, whether in your home or in your church. Just don't hope it doesn't blow up and try to keep it tamped down. And it's like there's a freedom that comes when you go, God approves me in Christ. I can just lead and trust him to lead and guide, to be humble, to be willing to repent, to take responsibility, to refuse all blame shifting. There's a real relief that comes in going like, God's got this. Like he's got this.
That's right.
So
it's great.
I think this is an excellent place to end because I certainly have loved this. And after this conversation, I'm looking forward to that even more.
Be fun.
So late February, we're excited to read that. Thank you for your work and the way you've served the church.
Yeah, appreciate you guys. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, gents.